Hey guys, tonight we drift to a place where sea winds sigh like restless monks and shadows cling to cliffs that plunge into black water. Mount Athos rises on the Aegean coast like a finger pointing stubbornly toward the heavens, and atop one of its ridges lies a ruin so shrouded in rumour that locals call it the monastery that never sleeps, even though no one has lived there for centuries. The stone arches stand broken against the sky. The bells are long gone, but some claim voices still rise in midnight hymns carried by salt-laden breezes. You probably wouldn't survive even one winter up there without serious preparation, frost isolation, and the occasional landslide remind us that medieval monks were built of sterner stuff than most of us scrolling on our phones. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fun to see this community map itself out across the globe. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The path to the ghost monastery begins with silence. Travellers describe the long climb through pine forests where the ground is soft with needles, and the air carries a mix of resin and sea spray. In the 15th century, pilgrims trudged the same slope, sandals scraping stone steps carved into the cliffside. The monastery itself, according to scattered chronicles, was founded not with the usual imperial grant, but through the stubborn efforts of a lone hermit who gathered disciples around a spring said to heal fevers. Mainstream historical fact confirms that Athos was indeed crowded with hermitages and skeets, small monastic communities by the Middle Ages, each claiming a holy spring or relic as its founding miracle. This particular ruin, though, leaves no clear dedication, no saint's name attached. That vagueness alone sets it apart from its neighbours. The walls, even in ruin, hold personality. Moss clings to the stones in patterns resembling faded icons as though the mountain itself insists on painting. Fishermen on the coast point upward at twilight and mutter that the monastery is alive in ways the living avoid. They say the wind that howls through broken windows is not mere air, but a choir of lost souls rehearsing endlessly. Quirky tidbit here, one local tale insists goats refuse to graze near the lower terraces, supposedly because they sense invisible monks shooing them away. If you know goats, you know they fear nothing short of thunder, so the idea that they avoid a patch of grass because of ghostly scolding is both eerie and oddly comical. Historians still argue whether the monastery was ever formally recognised by Constantinople. Some documents list 30+ monasteries on Athos by the 14th century, but this one appears only in marginal notes, almost like a footnote someone was reluctant to expand. Was it a breakaway community? A failed foundation? Or simply an isolated refuge that never won imperial attention? The ambiguity keeps scholars circling like gulls over a fishing boat, eager to snatch meaning from scraps. Imagine the monks trudging up with baskets of figs, russet robes, flapping in sea winds, their chants rising against the roar of gulls. By day they tilled gardens balanced on terraces. By night they kept vigils in a chapel whose floor was said to glow faintly when moonlight struck the marble veins just right. Even now the ruin holds that play of light streaks across stone like forgotten candles. Modern climbers report hearing trickles of water as though pipes still carry a spring, though no plumbing survives. The sensory echo of activity footsteps that aren't yours, a cough in empty air sets imaginations racing. A gentle joke eases the chill. One medieval traveller noted that Athonite monks ate such meagre meals, bread, olives and watered wine that he claimed even the ghosts must have been thin. If you've ever woken hungry at midnight and raided the fridge, imagine doing it for 40 years with only olives to greet you. No wonder spirits might linger still looking for a proper snack. The ghost monastery also ties into Athos's stricter rules. Mainstream fact again, Mount Athos was and remains closed to women, a practice rooted in both ascetic tradition and Byzantine law. Some fringe tales claim the monastery fell into ruin after a woman disguised as a pilgrim slipped inside, breaking the Virgin's protection. Other stories whisper that a relic housed there lost its power, condemning the place to silence. Historians shrug, there's no evidence, only overlapping legends that blur like ink in rain. Standing at the site, one feels layers pressing together: political upheavals of Byzantium-Ottoman sieges, the natural erasure of time, and above all the human tendency to explain absence with story. What was once perhaps only a minor community abandoned due to poverty now sits in the imagination as a haunted threshold, where every creak of pine or flutter of birdwing becomes a psalm from beyond. Another light joke sneaks in when locals say, if the ghosts still chant their offices, at least they're punctual, unlike the ferry to Athos. which as every modern pilgrim knows can be delayed for hours by weather bureaucracy or simply the boatman's lunch. Supernatural reliability might be the only dependable schedule on the peninsula. And then there is the view. The Aegean spreads out below like beaten bronze under sunlight, while storms paint it slate grey in winter. The monastery clings above this shifting sea, a reminder that human ambition sometimes builds in places meant only for gods and gulls. The ruin stands patient whispering, not with sound, but with the weight of what it once was and what people imagine it still is. As night falls, torches from neighbouring communities flicker distantly, but this ridge remains dark. The silence thickens. And so the first thread of the mystery lays itself across your thoughts. A monastery without patron, without record, but with endless rumour standing as both fact and ghost stone and story. The monks of Mount Athos wake before dawn, long before the sun has brushed its light over the Aegean. They rise in stone cells that smell of beeswax and salt, pull on rough wool habits dyed in shades of indigo or russet, and shuffle down narrow corridors that echo like caves. Tonight's tale slips deeper into this mountain world, for here, the so-called ghost monastery takes shape not as a haunted castle with rattling chains, but as a half-remembered ruin that is half stone, half story. To picture it, you must imagine not only the visible bricks, but the weight of centuries of rumour stacked on top of them. Mainstream fact gives us our first anchor. Mount Athos has been a monastic republic since the 9th century, legally recognised by Byzantine emperors, who granted charters to communities of monks. Its 20 great monasteries still stand today, each with rules that blend Greek Orthodox practice with stubborn local tradition. That makes the idea of a forgotten, vanished house of prayer doubly strange. Monasteries are usually documented with obsessive lists of relics, land grants, and imperial donations. Yet here there are whispers of a cloister that slipped through the cracks, remembered only in scattered chronicles and the cautious gossip of later monks. Historians still argue whether this ghost monastery was a real institution erased by time, or merely a phantom born from pious imagination. They argue too about its supposed location. Some suggest the northern slopes, where cliffs tumble straight into the sea, and caves dot the rock like candle niches. Others place it higher up, where pines whisper in icy winds, and clouds cling to the peaks. The lack of ruins leaves the debate wide open. Fringe tidbits slip in one 19th century traveller claimed that monks spoke of an abbey, visible only on moonless nights, its walls glowing faintly like frost in starlight. Another story says shepherds heard chanting where no monastery stood, voices fading whenever they drew near. Sceptical, of course, but the Byzantines thrived on this kind of layered rumour. As the narrative unfolds, the monastery is not just missing in bricks, it is missing in paper. No charter in imperial archives, no mention in patriarchal lists, only occasional allusions in marginal notes. Imagine a scribe bored while copying psalms, scribbling, and near Athos lies a cloister that fell to ruin whose bells are heard though no tower stands. A scribble meant to break monotony becomes centuries later the seed of legend. The monks who read such notes surely wondered, was this warning allegory or a careless joke? Modern archaeologists poke about Athos with measured steps, though access is tightly restricted. They find traces of hermitages carved into cliff staircases that lead nowhere, and cisterns that once collected rainwater for vanished houses. Could one of these be the foundation of the ghost monastery? Scholars still debate whether these structures belong to short-lived monastic experiments, small groups who tried to form a brotherhood but failed, or whether storytellers inflated a simple, abandoned skeet into a full-fledged phantom cloister. One thing is certain, Athos has always been a magnet for both fact and fable. Picture the sensory world sea spray flecking the rocks, goats clattering along paths, gulls shrieking overhead. By night, lanterns swing from wooden beams, casting saffron light across frescoes of saints whose eyes follow you. In the half-lit silence, a creak of timber can feel like a whisper. A monk kneeling at prayer might swear he hears chanting outside, though no brother walks the courtyard. It takes only a hint of imagination stirred with fatigue and faith to transform shadows into a ghostly choir. And since every community relayed stories by voice, such whispers spread like ivy, entangling belief with the ordinary creak of wood. Humour slips in here too, for even monks are not without their sly wit. One tale tells of a cook who insisted the ghost monk stole bread from his oven, leaving only ashes behind. The abbot scolded him for blasphemy, but the cook defended himself. If angels may eat manna, surely ghosts may nibble loaves. His fellow brothers laughed, though nervously, and some swore the oven did seem cooler in the mornings. The ghost monastery gains shape as more than a ruin. It becomes a metaphor for fragility. Every stone cloister that still stands reminds Athos of one that did not. Every new novice walking through the gates knows that his community too could one day slip into silence. And so, the tale persists, because people find comfort in imagining company, even ghostly company, on the path of devotion. A monastery may crumble, but its memory clings like incense to the rafters of history. The monks themselves, centuries later, still debate whether the story should be embraced or ignored. Some treat it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that pride leads to ruin. Others consider it an insult to Athos's sanctity, preferring silence over speculation. Pilgrims, meanwhile, love it. Tourists in the 19th century carried it back to Europe, repeating the tale of a monastery that rings bells no one can see. And modern readers find in it the perfect blend of mystery and faith, the kind of story that whispers just as you are about to fall asleep. One last joke lingers like the echo of a bell. A visiting sailor once asked a monk if the ghost monastery charged rent. The monk replied, deadpan, "Yes, but the payment is eternal silence. Even legends need landlords, it seems." And so the monastery that may never have existed continues to live more vibrantly than many that certainly did. It stands on no map, leaves no receipts, yet it hums in the imagination. As you drift deeper into tonight's journey, keep in mind how absence often weighs heavier than presence. A locked door, an empty cloister, a silence that sings, all of these become stages where the human mind performs its most persistent play, the search for meaning in mystery. The monastery rises where cliffs drop steeply into the Aegean, a place where seabirds wheel and the salt spray tastes sharp on the tongue. Pilgrims climb the winding track toward its gates, breathing hard robes clinging with sweat, wondering if their lungs or their souls will give out first. The path feels like penance. Even before prayers begin, stones shifting underfoot, thorny shrubs scratching ankles. It is here, halfway up the climb, that the first stories take root. Whispers of monks who vanished into caves and never came back, of lights seen burning on lonely ridges when the oil lamps of men were long extinguished. Travellers mutter that if a monastery is difficult to reach, it must also be difficult to leave, though no one laughs too loudly in case the wind carries the joke to unfriendly ears. Mainstream fact offers a grounding hand. Mount Athos was declared a monastic republic as early as the 9th century, and by the High Byzantine period more than 20 major monasteries dotted its slopes. The mountain was granted autonomy by imperial decrees, its communities exempt from taxation, and outsiders forbidden to settle. This legal framework helped preserve Athos as a stronghold of spiritual life long after the empire's fortunes faltered. Yet those imperial charters also created the aura of secrecy laws that kept women, and often even laymen, from setting foot on its land, reinforced the notion that the mountain was less a peninsula than a world apart. The road to the ghost monastery passes between chapels where frescoes have faded to ghostly smears of blue and red, the saints' eyes washed pale by centuries of sea wind. The path twists upward until it forks one side to living monasteries, the other to ruins. Old maps sometimes sketch the fork, but rarely label it, as though cartographers preferred to keep the haunted track unnamed. Pilgrims who took the wrong turn spoke later of silence too complete, as if even insects refused the place. That silence was said to carry weight, pressing against ears like water against a diver's head. Quirky tidbits cling to the route. One tradition insists that a fig tree once grew from a crack in the monastery's outer wall, producing fruit that never ripened. Locals swore the tree marked the spot where a thief tried to climb over with stolen bread, only to turn to stone mid-motion, leaving roots sprouting from his frozen limbs. Skeptics dismissed the tale as a folk tale stitched onto a convenient stump, but children repeated it gleefully, pointing at the blackened roots as proof that the mountain itself punished dishonour. Scholars still argue whether the ghost monastery had any official name at all. Some claim it was once dedicated to St. Basil, its foundation charter lost when Ottoman raids burned archives. Others say it was never formally chartered, just a skeet, a smaller dependency that grew beyond its size then collapsed. The absence of written record fuels the mystery. A monastery without a name is like a book without a title page. Readers fill the blank with whatever tale pleases them most. One pilgrim account from the 13th century describes entering a ruined courtyard where marble columns leaned drunkenly pigeons roosting on capitals carved with crosses. The writer confesses he turned back at once, claiming an unseen hand tugged his cloak. Whether he felt a branch or his own nerves, later chroniclers gleefully copied the story, making the ghost monastery a place where even fabric refused obedience. The detail has the ring of exaggeration, but it also illustrates how easily dread grows when stone and silence meet. The sensory palette here is easy to imagine. The air tastes metallic from the sea mingled with the resin scent of pines clinging to slopes. Boots scuff loose shale, sending rattles echoing into gorges. Lantern light dances on damp stone, glinting off lizards' eyes before they vanish. Inside half-collapsed cloisters, the coolness smells of mildew and beeswax long since hardened. Those who stay long enough say their breaths come back to them with an odd delay, as though the walls need to decide whether to echo or to swallow. Gentle humour threads the unease. One guide jokes that the real miracle of Athos is not spiritual enlightenment, but simply reaching a monastery without twisting an ankle. Another says monks designed their staircases specifically to punish knees, ensuring no pilgrim could reach the altar without prayer by groaning joints. And a third quip whispered on cold nights claims the ghost monastery is the best landlord in Greece, no tenants, no rent, only silence collected each month. By dusk, shadows climb the ruined walls, turning arches into yawning mouths. Pilgrims who light candles find the flames bent sideways as though a draught issues from nowhere. A fisherman who once anchored below swore he saw the glow of torches weaving through cloisters, long abandoned only to vanish when he shouted. His children repeated the story in taverns until it became a local truth. Whether he mistook fireflies or not, the tale of wandering lights joined the monastery's growing wardrobe of mysteries. Historians note that Athos has always bred exaggeration. Its remoteness combined with imperial privilege made it fertile ground for rumour. A closed monastery becomes not just a building, but a vessel into which fears, hopes and jokes are poured. By the time we hear of it now, the ghost monastery is already less stone than story half crumbled into earth, half standing in imagination. They climb further along the narrow paths that twist upward through the dense forest of Mount Athos, where twisted olive trees give way to pines and chestnuts. The air grows cooler with every step, and the wind carries faint whiffs of salt from the Aegean Sea below. Shadows stretch long, for the sun sets quickly in these ravines, and in those deepening shadows the outline of a half-collapsed stone wall begins to emerge. It is here, hidden from the pilgrim's main routes, that a story begins to harden into rumour, the story of a monastery that should not be here, or perhaps should not exist at all. Mainstream historical fact confirms that Mount Athos has been a monastic republic since at least the 10th century, with imperial decrees forbidding women from entering, and Byzantine emperors granting privileges that ensured autonomy. Each official monastery, whether perched on cliffs or settled into valleys, kept careful records, charters and seals. And yet among all those archives, not one consistent record mentions the ruin that locals whisper about near the ridgeline. That absence alone fuels the imagination for what monastery leaves no trace but crumbling stones. One story told by shepherds insists that the monastery was founded by exiled monks who rejected the strict hierarchy of Athonite life. Instead of submitting to the abbots of the great houses like Vatopede or Yveron, they carved out their own hermitage on the high ridge, believing solitude and secrecy would bring them closer to heaven. The ruins seem to support this notion. The walls are thin, almost makeshift, and the chapel space is narrow as though built in haste. Quirky tidbit villagers sometimes claim that goats refuse to graze near the site, as if even animals sense the place is touched by something other than weather and stone. They pause before a heavy wooden lintel, blackened by time, that still clings to a surviving arch. The smell of pine resin drifts on the air, yet beneath it lingers a faint mustiness like damp parchment, as though the stones themselves sweat history. Birds wheel above, shrieking against the twilight, and for a moment the place seems alive, watching, waiting. Historians still argue whether these ruins ever functioned as a true monastery, or if they are misidentified remnants of a defensive outpost. The lack of clear foundations for cloisters or refectories raises doubts, but the apse of a chapel remains suggesting at least some sacred use. The guide, an old man in a teal wool cloak, points toward the crumbling wall and mutters that prayers once echoed here at midnight, prayers to saints whose names no longer appear in liturgies. His voice carries a note of half mockery, half fear, as though he does not quite believe what he says, yet feels compelled to repeat it. When asked if the place is cursed, he chuckles. Cursed. No worse. Forgotten. The answer sits heavier than any talk of demons. The narrator's tone softens, describing how the torchlight flickers against broken masonry. Lichen crawls like script over the blocks, and one might imagine letters, words, sentences forming, if only the eye stared long enough. The eerie quiet presses closer, so close that a careless joke slips out. Perhaps the monks abandoned the place not for spiritual reasons, but because their cook kept burning the lentils and no brotherhood can survive scorched stew. The laugh, though gentle, echoes strangely off the walls as if returned by voices that have not spoken for centuries. Night presses in faster at this height. The group feels the bite of wind sweeping down from the peaks. Cloaks wrap tighter, footsteps crunch slower, and the sense of trespassing grows sharper. In this suspended moment, the monastery ceases to be mere ruin. It becomes a threshold. A doorless arch, a shadowed cell, a stone stair spiralling nowhere, all combine into a stage where legend can perform. Mainstream chronicles of Athos list 20 major monasteries by the 15th century, each guarded and catalogued with precision. Yet this place remains off the rolls. Could it be one of the smaller skeets forgotten after plague or war, or was it erased deliberately, its memory unwelcome? Historians still argue whether an imperial decree once commanded its sealing, though no parchment yet proves the case. A second joke brightens the air. Someone mutters that if monks truly prayed here, they must have picked this remote perch to keep their wine hidden from abbots who counted every jug. The thought brings a ripple of amusement, though it quickly fades under the hush of the ruins. As lanterns sputter, the narrator points out that ivy has wrapped itself around a collapsed icon niche. The stone is chipped, the plaster faded, but faint traces of red and gold paint cling stubbornly. A face once gazed out Christ a saint, or perhaps the Virgin, but erosion has blurred it into an almost spectral outline. That half-vanished visage seems to watch still, a reminder that devotion leaves marks even when time refuses to remember names. The air grows colder, breath clouds in pale mist, and there amid the ruins they stand at the threshold of deeper mystery. Was this monastery an act of rebellion, a refuge? A place struck from the rolls for heresy or crime, the stones hold no answers, only silence. Yet that silence hums with weight like a choir rehearsing beneath the ground. Final joke eases the weight. One listener sighs that if history refuses to give clear answers, perhaps they should just post a lost and found notice for monasteries. Missing one chapel, some walls, a dozen monks, please return if found. The group chuckles, but their laughter sounds thin in the night air, and so the story closes on the image of the forgotten ruin perched above the sea, refusing to explain itself. The torches burn low, the path winds onward, and the ghost monastery becomes less of a ruin and more of a riddle pressed against the stars. The monastery that sits cloaked in the mists of Mount Athos does not look like much when approached from the goat-worn paths that snake up its slope. Its stones are old, yes, but no older than the other Byzantine foundations scattered across the holy mountain. Yet the stories that swirl around it cling more stubbornly than ivy, suggesting that this was never just a pile of masonry. Here rumour insists the monks once held a relic so strange that even hardened pilgrims shifted uneasily when its presence was mentioned. Mainstream history records that Athos, long before this monastery was built, already boasted an unparalleled density of monastic life. By the 10th century, it was officially recognised as a republic of monks ruled not by kings but by abbots and councils, each community answering to its own strict code. Imperial charters poured resources into these cloisters, vineyards, fishing rights, and tax exemptions, all to make sure prayers rose from Athos like smoke day and night. The emperor's treasury funded the repair of walls and the illumination of manuscripts as if bricks and parchment could keep the empire itself from fraying. Against that background of discipline, the so-called ghost monastery looks even more peculiar. Chroniclers who dared to mention it placed it just beyond one of the lesser-known ridges where the winds whip stronger than anywhere else on the peninsula. Pilgrims claimed that even when the sun was high, its courtyard seemed shrouded in shadow. Some said bells rang there at hours when no services were scheduled, tolls echoing through valleys like reminders of forgotten prayers. The eerie detail was that no one admitted to ringing them. One quirky tidbit surfaces in the pages of a 15th century traveller's diary. He writes that a hermit guided him near the site and warned him not to look directly at the gate after dusk, lest he see faces pressed against the wood faces of those long buried. He claimed he looked anyway and saw nothing but planks. Yet the warning itself lingered, and future generations repeated it, convinced the monastery's entrance was more threshold than door. The relics supposedly housed their shifts, depending on which retelling you hear. Some insist it was a fragment of the true cross, others that it was the skull of a forgotten martyr, still others that it was a copy of the Gospels said to glow faintly in candlelight. Historians still argue whether any such object ever existed in that cloister, or whether these were simply legends borrowed from more famous monasteries and draped over a quieter, more obscure foundation. The ambiguity feeds the imagination much as a locked box tempts a curious hand. Consider the sensory weight of the place. The sea winds climb the mountain and crash against its walls, rattling shutters so violently that they sound like voices shouting in anger. The stone floors inside stay cold even in summer, so that sandals slap against chill surfaces as though stepping into a crypt. Incense, when burned, seems to linger longer than usual, clinging to beams until the rafters smell holy even when no censer swings. At night, oil lamps sputter and the shadows stretch unnaturally high, painted across walls like phantom processions. One light joke creeps in here. If you have ever walked into a basement where the motion sensor light flickered on too slowly, you know the jump of panic that even electrical delay can cause. Now imagine that same flicker happening with candles in a medieval monastery when your fellow monk has just finished telling you that demons dislike being ignored. That is precisely the kind of atmosphere that made the ghost monastery thrive in rumour. The community that supposedly lived there appears in records only faintly like ink washed by rain. Some lists of Athonite abbots omit it entirely. Others slip its name in only once or twice, as though the scribe hesitated before committing it to parchment. Modern scholars suggest this may reflect a real but short-lived brotherhood swallowed by fire plague or disbandment, yet even a brief existence was enough for tales to stick. The monastery's very obscurity became its strength. The less detail preserved, the more space for embellishment. Pilgrims spoke of corridors too narrow for practical design, where two men could not pass without brushing shoulders. They whispered of frescoes that faded not from age, but as though painted figures had chosen to retreat into the plaster, weary of being stared at. The garden supposedly planted with grapevines was said to bear fruit that tasted sour even when ripe, as if watered with salt instead of rain. All of these descriptions may be exaggerations, but together they construct a space that feels alive, brooding and unwilling to be forgotten. Another light joke surfaces among the tales. Some locals quipped that the sour grapes were simply the monks' excuse for why their wine tasted terrible, preferring to blame supernatural irrigation rather than poor viticulture. In a land where vineyards usually thrived, blaming ghosts was apparently more fashionable than admitting bad gardening. The monastery's decline is equally uncertain. Some accounts insist the community vanished overnight, leaving food half-prepared on wooden tables, as though raptured by unseen hands. Others suggest that during one of the Ottoman raids that swept the region, the monks fled never to return. A few bolder voices whisper that they dug deep cellars, sealed themselves inside with their relic, and vowed to wait until the empire returned to glory. Historians still argue whether such a retreat could have been logistically possible, or whether it is simply another echo of the Christian hope for resurrection transposed into stone and mortar. The physical traces today are faint. Stones crumble into moss paths, dissolve into thorn, and the mountain reclaims what human hands once shaped. Yet even now, climbers on Athos occasionally report stumbling upon walls too squared to be natural doorways leading nowhere and niches where icons might once have hung. Rationally, these could be fragments of any abandoned cell or outbuilding. Yet the legend insists they belong to the ghost monastery, clinging stubbornly to its claim on mystery. Another joke, gentle but sharp, eases the tension. If every mossy wall fragment on Mount Athos counts as part of a ghost monastery, then the mountain could host an entire city of ghosts. Tourists would need maps not for trails, but for hauntings, a kind of supernatural subway system. Of course, monks of Athos today smile politely at such suggestions, and then guide pilgrims back toward the chapel still full of prayer. Thus, the monastery persists less in brick than in imagination. Each whisper, each shadow, each gust of cold air becomes another stone in its invisible structure. And so, as the tale unfolds, the ghost monastery atop Mount Athos shifts from neglected ruin to stage for unsolved wonder, teaching us that absence too can build walls stronger than any mason's craft. The monks who remain in whispers rather than in flesh are the real architects of this place's afterlife. Their voices never quite vanish from Mount Athos. Instead, they seep into stones and seep into stories passed from pilgrim to pilgrim, like a candle flame relit at dusk. Some say the monastery's cloisters are still walked by cowled figures whose feet leave no imprint, who move as if gliding rather than trudging heads, bowed chanting syllables lost to living memory. A listener might shrug and say wind through the arches makes its own hymns, but the legends have more staying power than physics. After all, physics doesn't tuck you in at night, but a story about ghostly monks that lingers like incense in the rafters. Mainstream historical fact affirms that Mount Athos was not an ordinary landscape even in medieval times. It was and remains a peninsula devoted entirely to monastic life. By imperial decree dating back to at least the 10th century, women, and even most animals, were forbidden to set foot there. The Athenite Charter turned it into a republic of prayer, where every stone wall belonged not to a landlord, but to the Virgin Mary herself, revered as the mountain's eternal abbess. This sacred exclusivity made it a beacon for hermits and seekers who wanted to vanish from worldly distractions. Yet it also meant that the land sprouted more monasteries than fields, so each cloister, grand or humble, found itself under constant scrutiny from neighbours and chroniclers alike. A monastery that faded into ruin or rumour didn't simply vanish. It became a question mark carved into holy geography. Imagine the ghost monastery as a cluster of cells perched high, where the mountain thins into sky. Picture narrow stairs curling along rock walls patched with lime roofs, tiled in red but chipped by centuries of storms. Legends claim the brethren built their home here to be closer to heaven, though skeptics might say the builders simply wanted a strategic view of pirate sails gliding on the Aegean. Either way, the placement gives the ruin its uncanny aura. Every step along the ridge feels like straddling a line between the earthly and the divine, the visible and the hidden. A quirky tidbit trickles down from later guides. Locals sometimes referred to the site as the House of Unfinished Prayers. Supposedly, this nickname came from the belief that the monks died mid-chant, their liturgy left hanging in the air like half-knitted fabric. Travellers in later centuries claimed they heard verses resume at dusk, echoing from nowhere. Whether these sounds were monks rehearsing elsewhere or simply shepherds whistling as they herded goats, the imagination preferred to connect them to the spectral choir. Because let's be honest, invisible monks humming from the clouds sounds far more memorable than distracted goat herders. Scholars still argue whether any monastery truly stood in the exact spot the stories describe. Archaeological surveys of Mount Athos have documented dozens of ruined hermitages, but the so-called ghost cloister resists neat identification. Was it a real institution lost to time, or merely a tale born in the imagination of pilgrims eager to bring home marvels? Some historians propose that 2 or 3 different ruins may have merged into one legend braided together like candle wicks, until no one could tell which flame was original. Others suggest the monastery may never have existed beyond rumour, serving instead as a cautionary tale about neglecting spiritual discipline. Either way, the uncertainty does nothing to dim its allure. If anything, mystery fertilises the legend further. Now comes a light joke, soft enough for bedtime. If you've ever left your phone charger at home and spent the day wandering desperate for a socket, you know the feeling of an unfinished prayer. The monks apparently just had the medieval edition chant half-sung liturgy, half done, no outlet nearby to finish the job. It's reassuring to know even sanctity can be interrupted by life's little hiccups. Visitors who dared the climb often reported peculiar sensations. Some swore that stepping into the monastery's courtyard felt like entering thicker air, as though the atmosphere itself resisted intrusion. Others noticed sudden chills, the kind that prickle your arms even on a summer evening. A few wrote that birds avoided the ruined rafters circling above but never perching. Rational explanations abound, draft's altitude stone cooled by shade, but the travellers' accounts always lean toward the uncanny. One Italian pilgrim quipped that the place smelled of both mould and miracles, which may be the most accurate description ever penned about medieval ruins. At night, the monastery's silhouette blended with the mountain until moonlight etched it into shape. From far below, sailors swore they saw lanterns flicker among its windows even though no community remained there. Such lights might have been fireflies or distant watchfires from other settlements, but to believers they were the monks keeping vigil. Tales spread that if you followed those lanterns with pure intent, you might glimpse a vision of the Virgin herself. Unsurprisingly, none of these sailors ever provided coordinates. Apparently divine apparitions don't pin well on maps. The ghost monastery also absorbed the anxieties of its era. In times of plague, some claimed it was sealed by angels to quarantine sin itself. During Ottoman incursions, whispers said the monks had melted into the rocks, awaiting the day when orthodoxy could rise unchallenged. Later, when earthquakes shook, Mount Athos villagers muttered that the tremors came from the cloister's foundations sighing. The building became a vessel for collective imagination filled with whatever fears or hopes needed an address. That's how legends work. You pour in dread on one side and out comes a story glittering like candlelight on the other. One more joke to lighten the tapestry. People today complain about ghosting when someone doesn't text back. Imagine ghosting in the Byzantine sense, not just one monk failing to reply, but an entire monastery disappearing mid-conversation. If nothing else, it shows that humans have been inventing creative excuses for silence since long before smartphones. Thus, the legend thickens. The ghost monastery is not simply a ruin of stone, it is a ruin of certainty. Every chronicler who pens a line about it leaves as many questions as answers. Did monks die mid-chant, leaving their voices to hover eternally? Did politics snuff the cloister, rewriting its memory into myth? Did the mountain itself choose to veil one of its children? These questions cannot be proved or disproved, which is why they keep being asked. The monastery lives on because it refuses to explain itself, like a closed book left on a lectern daring someone to turn a page. The mountain, for its part, keeps the secret well. Its pines sigh in the wind, its cliffs glimmer with salt spray, and its paths twist with the promise of silence. Somewhere among them lies the story of monks who may have walked out of history but never out of imagination. And so with every new generation that repeats the tale, the monastery steps again into twilight, its spectral choir ready to hum unseen verses in the fading light. The monastery's ghostly legend does not linger only on its silent cloisters, but spreads outward, seeping into the very landscape of Mount Athos. By the time winter winds whistle through the gullies, stories are already climbing faster than the goats that scramble across its slopes. Shepherds whisper that a pale figure sometimes appears on the ridge, robed in saffron or indigo, holding a lantern that never quite warms its glow. Fishermen in the bays below claim they see the monastery's windows flicker at night, though no monk has officially lived there in centuries. Even traders, those hard-nosed calculators of coin, admit that when they pass Athos by sea, they cross themselves and look the other way, as if the mountain might demand payment not in gold but in silence. Mainstream historical fact anchors this part of the tale. Mount Athos, known as the Holy Mountain, has been home to monastic communities since at least the 9th century, and by the Byzantine Golden Age it had grown into a confederation of monasteries renowned for their strict ascetic life. Monks here were granted privileges by emperors who issued golden bulls exempting them from taxation and interference. This official support turned the peninsula into one of the most enduring monastic centres in the world. Yet among these still thriving houses, the story of one that slipped away, one monastery that fell into ruin, and shadow, creates the irresistible paradox. Why would one foundation fade while others endured? Historians still argue whether this particular site was real and abandoned, or entirely a literary invention conjured to satisfy the Byzantine appetite for moralized mysteries. A quirky tidbit emerges in some accounts that blend folklore with pious detail. Pilgrims spoke of a secret cistern under the monastery, supposedly fed by an underground spring, whose water never froze even in the harshest winters. Locals claimed it was blessed or cursed, depending on who was telling the story. A monk once warned a visitor not to drink from it, insisting the water had turned brackish after a sin was committed within the walls. Another less grim rumour suggested that bees from the monastery produced honey that could cure fevers. Of course, there is no way to verify either, but both demonstrate how quickly a place of stone can become a place of marvel once storytellers take hold. The sensory impressions of Athos add weight to such rumours. The sea wind carries salt and resin from the pines, while the mountain air feels sharp, almost surgical in its clarity. Imagine walking toward the ruined cloister. Frost crunches underfoot, and above the cliffs loom like grey shoulders draped in mist. The silence is punctuated only by the occasional toll of a bell from another monastery miles away, its sound warped and softened by the hills. To step across the broken threshold feels like stepping from the living world into a waiting dream. The stones smell of damp lichen. The wooden beams overhead creak as though still burdened by prayers long since silenced. One can see how such sensations could stir the imagination into ghosts. Light joke one eases the mood. If you've ever walked into an abandoned house and immediately sworn you heard footsteps upstairs, you understand exactly how medieval pilgrims felt, approaching Athos's ruined cloister. They just didn't have the option of blaming creaky plumbing. Scholars debate whether earthquakes may have contributed to the ruin. The Athos Peninsula is seismically active, and tremors are known to have damaged other Byzantine structures along the Aegean. Some argue that one particularly severe quake in the 14th century might have cracked foundations leading to abandonment. Others suspect piracy raiders from the sea were a constant menace, and monasteries close to the shore often built towers for defence. If this ghost monastery was less fortified, it could have been sacked, left to crumble, while stronger houses survived. Yet the absence of clear archaeological evidence keeps the debate alive, feeding the legend's shadowy charm. Pilgrims in later centuries embroidered the tale further. Some claimed that on holy nights faint chants could be heard, rising from the ruin, as if monks still sang the midnight office beneath collapsed vaults. Others swore that when storms gathered over the Aegean, lightning always struck near the ghost monastery, never elsewhere on the ridge. Was it divine warning, or simply the physics of tall stone attracting skyfire? Historians still argue whether such stories preserve kernels of truth, or are simply products of imaginative devotion. Light Joke 2 slips in one chronicler, dryly observed that the ghost chants could easily have been wind whistling through broken arches, but he also admitted if wind sings like monks, it deserves its own monastery. You have to admire the honesty. The fascination of this ruined monastery lies not only in its physical absence, but in the way it symbolises fragility amid endurance. Mount Athos as a whole has survived centuries of invasions, fires, and even Ottoman oversight. Yet this one story insists that a cloister fell silent forever. It becomes an allegory. The mountain is eternal, but not every prayer echoes forever. That tension between permanence and loss is the fertile soil in which legends thrive. Villagers in nearby Chalkidiki kept the tale alive through proverbs. Beware the house that prays too proudly, one saying when hinting that pride led to the monastery's fall. Another proverb less solemn claimed, if the ghost monks call you in, they only want someone to fix the roof. Light Joke 3 grows from this medieval humour was apparently not so different from today's workplace banter, always finding a way to turn tragedy into a complaint about repairs. As the centuries pass, the monastery's ruins blur further into memory. Pilgrims sketch arches where only rocks remain. Monks mutter warnings to novices not to wander too close. But the ghost cloister still stands in the imagination, etched more deeply than many surviving structures. It is not just a ruin, it is a parable in stone, one that carries through the air like incense long after the fire has gone out. The monastery on Mount Athos does not simply rest on its rock like any other ruin. It seems to balance on memory itself. By the later centuries of Byzantium, when emperors were distracted by threats on every frontier, the ghost monastery had already begun to attract a peculiar status. Pilgrims trudged along goat paths hoping to glimpse a holy site untouched by worldly corruption. Sailors pointed it out from the deck, noting the way it gleamed in morning light, as though the walls were painted not with lime but with dawn itself. Chroniclers ever fond of making simple things complicated wrote that this monastery was both abandoned and inhabited, at once a paradox to test the faith of any listener. Mainstream historical fact steadies the story. Mount Athos, known as the Holy Mountain, has hosted monastic communities since at least the 9th century, with imperial charters confirming their privileges. Entire networks of monasteries flourished there, some of them still standing today. This ghostly house was not an isolated fantasy, but one piece in a landscape where prayer politics and property rights overlapped constantly. Still, what makes it special is the sense that it slipped sideways into legend, as if the other monasteries carried on in daylight while this one folded itself into twilight. One quirky tidbit survives in later rumour villages in nearby Chalkidiki claimed that the monastery's bells rang on their own whenever a storm approached, though no monk was present to pull the ropes. Some swore they heard Latin chants rather than Greek, as if foreign monks had once lingered there and refused to give up their sound. Historians still argue whether these reports reflect echoes from other active monasteries or whether they belong in the long list of charming impossibilities the mountain seems to inspire. Picture the sensory load of visiting the ruins in winter. The paths crunch with frost beneath worn boots, the air tastes of salt from the Aegean mixed with pine resin from the slopes, and the silence is pierced only by the occasional crow. A pilgrim presses his hand to the stone expecting warmth from sun, and finds instead a chill that runs into his bones. He lights a taper, sets it in a crevice, and steps back watching the flame waver in the sea breeze. To him that single flicker may confirm the monastery's sanctity, even though the rest of the building is silent. To another, the same flame might prove the ghosts are curious enough to breathe on candles. Light Joke 1 drifts in here if you've ever visited an old office building on the weekend when the fluorescent lights hum without anyone around. You know the odd mix of comfort and creepiness that ruins can deliver. Only on Athos, instead of wondering if the copier works, you wonder if a centuries-old monk still minds the rules. Byzantine politics added its own layers. Records mention imperial gifts, land vineyards, fishing rights, granted to monasteries across Athos. Yet this particular house never appears in the ledgers after a certain century, as if its paperwork evaporated. Did it fall out of favour with the dynasty? Did a scandal lead to its quiet erasure? Or was it simply too small and remote to merit attention? The absence of detail only fed the legend, because silence in archives is like silence in a cloister. It begs interpretation. Historians still debate whether the monastery truly existed as a formal institution, or whether it began as a hermitage later embroidered into grandeur by local imagination. Meanwhile, travellers passing through the region spun the mystery further. A Catalan mercenary is said to have sworn he saw monks standing on the walls in saffron and teal robes, though when he approached the gate he found it chained. A Russian pilgrim wrote of hearing psalms in the wind, though his diary confesses he had drunk freely from a wine flask that morning. These scattered glimpses, whether serious or comical, became threads woven into the ghost monastery's reputation. Light joke 2 fits naturally here. Imagine telling your friends that you saw a monastery full of singing monks, only to admit you also sampled the strong local wine first. It is history's way of saying, maybe hydrate before declaring miracles. Archaeology adds to the puzzle but never resolves it. Foundations exist on Mount Athos where no living monastery remains small clusters of stone that could have been chapels, hermitages or way stations for travellers. One such ruin with walls barely waist high could easily have been the seed of the ghost legend. But because monks on Athos controlled their narrative carefully, and outsiders were often restricted, rumours grew faster than explanations. A toppled lintel became a miracle. A collapsed roof became proof of divine punishment. The stones themselves seemed to shrug, offering no clear confession. By night, the setting turns from curious to uncanny. Moonlight glints on broken tiles, owls sweep noiselessly across the courtyards, and the surf pounds steadily below. To stand there is to feel both tiny and watched, as though the mountain itself is aware of intruders. Pilgrims who braved such nights left, changed, not always sure whether they had been blessed or merely spooked. Some carried home stories of glowing figures in the chapels. Others muttered about shadows that moved independently of torchlight. Whether exaggerated or not, these impressions ensured that the ghost monastery lived longer in memory than in masonry. Light joke 3 helps ease the tension. A villager once quipped that if the monks really had vanished, it was probably because they got tired of visitors asking for free lodging and better wine. Humour has always been the cheapest exorcism for fear. As centuries passed, the legend stretched into new shapes. For some, the ghost monastery symbolised endurance. Even when abandoned, it kept ringing in storms and standing in stories. For others, it symbolised warning, a sign that pride or negligence leads to oblivion. Modern historians sift through fragments of parchment, half-collapsed stones and contradictory diaries, trying to decide whether to label it real or imagined. And yet the persistence of the tale proves something more important, that mystery itself is part of Mount Athos's gift. The monastery atop the holy mountain, whether ghost or stone, reminds us how people lean into ambiguity. It tells us that when facts falter, imagination eagerly fills the cracks, and that sometimes ruins are built not only of masonry, but of memory. In that sense, the ghost monastery stands as firmly today in story as any surviving abbey stands in stone. Storms roll in from the Aegean with a kind of inevitability that makes sailors sigh before the first drops fall. On Mount Athos, the monasteries sit perched like chess pieces on the cliff edges, and when thunder rolls, the sound strikes both sea and stone. The ghost monastery is no exception. Its shattered roofline frames the sky like jagged teeth, and the rain runs down walls that haven't seen repairs in centuries. Inside, the water pools on cracked flagstones carrying pine needles, feathers, and once, according to a fisherman's story, a small fish that flopped about on the chapel floor until someone scooped it up and carried it back to the sea. In these storms, legend always feels close because nature itself becomes the voice retelling the story. Mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. Athos is famous for its weather. The peninsula is a sharp finger of land jutting into the Aegean, funneling winds and storms with little mercy. Mariners in antiquity feared rounding its tip so much that ancient geographers called it treacherous. Byzantine chroniclers later echoed the same warnings, noting how monasteries braced themselves against gales that could topple scaffolding and shatter tiles. So when a ruin is said to whisper during a storm, the setting is ready-made for belief. Rain slaps, wind howls, and the sea below throws spray high enough to salt the cloisters. Quirky tidbits survive in the stories of monks themselves. One tale insists that lightning never struck the ghost monastery directly because saints shielded it, even as storms battered its neighbours. Another flips the tale, claiming that lightning struck so often it burned away any attempt at repair, proving heaven did not want the building revived. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect memory of actual fires, or whether they're part of the myth-making that attaches itself to ruins. After all, nothing adds gravitas like imagining thunder as divine punctuation. Step closer, and the sensory details crowd in. Rain drips steadily from broken beams, echoing like a metronome in the empty refectory. Wind winds through keyholes in the doors, turning the smallest holes into shrill flutes. The smell is sharp, wet, stone-soaked wood, and the faint mineral tang of moss that spreads in green patches across the plaster. The floor becomes slick, and gulls sometimes shelter under arches, flapping noisily when disturbed. It's easy to see why locals thought the monastery groaned or sighed. Buildings under stress have their own language, and in storms the vocabulary expands. Here comes the first light joke if you've ever listened to your own house. Creak in a storm and thought, well, if the walls are speaking, I hope they're saying nice things, then you understand the Athonite habit of giving personality to masonry. The monks, with their mix of seriousness and humour, simply elevated that instinct into theology. Beyond the ruin itself, storms changed how people moved. Fishermen pulled boats higher on shore, traders delayed journeys, and monks in other monasteries doubled their prayers during tempests. The ghost monastery, empty of residents, became a lightning rod for imagination. Some said the roofless chapel filled with spectral chanting during storms, the voices rising with the thunder and fading when silence returned. A few travellers even claimed to see lights flickering inside lanterns without hands to hold them. Was it reflections from lightning? Was it sea spray catching fire in the air? Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerations or sincere attempts to describe eerie sights. On calmer days after storms, villagers sometimes climbed up to survey the damage. They found beams, charred plaster cracked, and once a weathered icon half buried in mud. Such finds became trophies of a sort, proof that the monastery still had secrets to give. Some were carried down to churches and set on altars. Others were hidden away in homes as protective charms. A few perhaps were simply sold to passing pilgrims with a whispered tale attached. Superstition and commerce have always made good companions. Second light joke. Imagine if modern souvenir shops sold genuine storm-touched ruins, guaranteed to echo when shaken. Byzantines would have bought them in droves, because who doesn't like a relic with a story attached? Storms also revealed the fragility of empire itself. When roofs cracked and walls split, they reminded people that even holy ground could crumble. Chroniclers fond of symbolism often drew parallels between lightning splitting a monastery wall and sin splitting the fabric of society. A ruin became more than broken stone. It became a sermon. Some monks claimed that each crack was a reminder that prayer alone could not hold back the weather, that humility was required as much as mortar. Others suggested the opposite, that only lack of faith explained the ruin. The debates grew as loud as the thunder outside, though perhaps not as effective at keeping the rain off one's head. The ghost monastery, because of its reputation, drew more than just storms. It drew questions. If the building still stood, why not rebuild? Why not rededicate it? Clear the rubble and reclaim the ground. Some scholars today argue that storms themselves made it impractical, the site too exposed and dangerous. Others argue that superstition stopped any attempt. Would you rebuild a house, they ask, if you believed heaven had personally marked it for abandonment? The question lingers much like the lightning that still dances across the sea. Third light joke. Monks joked among themselves that rebuilding the ghost monastery would be like trying to repair a sieve with more holes than cloth. You'd fix one wall and another would tumble. Humour eased the weight of superstition, even if no one actually risked testing the truth. As the storm imagery fades, what remains is the paradox. Ruins that ought to have been erased by weather instead became stronger in story. Each lightning strike, each thunderclap was folded into the legend until the ghost monastery wasn't just a wreck, it was a voice. It spoke in groans of timber, in cracks of thunder, in the nervous laughter of villagers who retold the tales on winter nights. And so, the stormy chapter of its history continued long after the monks who built it had turned to dust. The monastery now rests in twilight, both literally and figuratively, a ruin that whispers instead of shouts. The final steps of this long story bring us to its quiet endurance, how a cluster of stones, arches and broken icons has managed to outlast empires, wars and centuries of indifference. It still stands atop Mount Athos, although whether it is a ruin, a relic or a riddle depends on who does the looking. To the pilgrim it is a holy site. To the scholar it is a puzzle. To the local fisherman who points toward it with a weathered hand while hauling in his nets, it is simply the ghost place. And to listeners tonight, it is a lullaby spun from history, shadow and imagination. Mainstream fact brings a firm reminder. Mount Athos today remains a living monastic republic recognized by Greece and respected by Orthodox Christianity as a sacred enclave. Its 20 functioning monasteries are filled with monks who still rise before dawn, to chant prayers that echo through stone cloisters. Yet scattered among them are ruins of vanished houses, cells and hermitages, and one of these, the Ghost Monastery, holds its place in both maps and myths. Tourists and pilgrims are rarely allowed up close, but from certain paths you can glimpse its skeletal outline like a tooth left in the jaw of history. A quirky tidbit is told by boatmen who circle the peninsula. They claim that if you sail near its cliffs at night, lights appear where no monk lives. Faint blue glows dancing as though lanterns are still carried in ruined hallways. Rational minds blame phosphorescent insects, or tricks of moonlight on wet stone, but stories spread faster than reason. One fisherman even swore he saw a robed figure wave from a balcony that collapsed 100 years ago. His companions laughed, then admitted later that none of them could explain why their nets were empty that night. The debates still unfold like restless waves. Historians argue whether the monastery fell to fire to neglect or to deliberate closure after an outbreak of plague. Archaeologists present shards, burned beams, and faint outlines of collapsed chapels, but nothing decisive. Devout chroniclers insist a vision closed its doors, while sceptical moderns see only the slow decay of stone when left untended. And so, the paradox lingers: does the Ghost Monastery endure because of divine mystery, or simply because ruins invite imagination to move in? The answer is elusive, which is why the story continues to breathe. The sensory impressions linger in anyone who visits. Picture worn flagstones slick with moss, an archway where ivy curls like script, and a faint smell of salt carried up from the sea. The wind is constant, sighing through broken windows, making even silence feel alive. Birds nest in the rafters where monks once prayed. In late evening, when shadows grow long, the ruin almost seems to straighten, as if memory is enough to hold it upright. That is the moment when the boundary between fact and legend blurs most sharply, when you can almost hear sandals scuffing and voices murmuring in chant. Light joke once softens the mood. Some travellers say the monastery must still be staffed because the goats in the area seem so well fed. Perhaps the ghosts are secretly herding them. Others point out that goats hardly need monks to thrive, they're the true eternal residents of Athos. As centuries passed, the Ghost Monastery became more than a place. It became a parable. To orthodox monks it reminded them of humility. No house of stone, however pious, survives without vigilance. To local storytellers it was proof that the holy never fully fades. To foreign visitors it was another marvel to jot down in journals a ruin alive with invisible tenants. To us hearing the story tonight, it is a meditation on how history slips between hands, yet still leaves warmth. Light Joke 2 floats in with a smile. If medieval monks had Yelp reviews, the Ghost Monastery would get 5 stars for atmosphere, -3 stars for service. You can never find anyone at the front door. Humour then as now keeps fear manageable. Even today, modern seekers climb paths near its walls, some with notebooks, others with prayer ropes. Scholars measure stones, sketch arches, and try to fit data into tidy footnotes. Pilgrims light candles at nearby chapels and whisper that they hear echoes from beyond. Tourists snap photos, though they are gently scolded if they intrude too far. Each gaze adds another layer, another retelling. The monastery in this way remains open not through doors, but through imagination. Light Joke 3 lands softly. Perhaps the reason it still feels inhabited is because monks are excellent at schedules. Even ghosts bound by liturgy must rise at midnight and chant until dawn. If you hear faint voices, it's not haunting, it's punctuality. And so, we draw the curtain on the Ghost Monastery of Mount Athos. It is neither holy fact nor holy fiction, but a fusion of the two. Its ruins stand as proof of stone, its legends stand as proof of yearning. The blend keeps it alive long after other monasteries have faded from memory. The lesson is not about certainty, but about acceptance that mystery is part of history's charm, and silence can be as eloquent as song. Now the story must slow like steps softening into dusk. Let the mind ease now as the tale of stone and shadow fades into quiet. Picture Mount Athos not as a battlefield of arguments, but as a peninsula wrapped in sea waves, lapping gently gulls circling lazily, and moonlight spilling across its slopes. The Ghost Monastery no longer looms or unsettles. It simply rests softened by ivy, its arches glowing faintly under the silver sky. Imagine standing nearby, breathing in the salt air, feeling the hush settle. There is no urgency here, no clamour of markets, no clang of armies. Only the steady rhythm of water against rock, steady as a heartbeat, steady as sleep itself drawing near. The monks are gone. The stories linger, but what remains is peace. Even the stones seem content to be quiet now. Close your eyes and feel the coolness of night spread like a blanket. Let the image of ruins fade into softness, not threat. They are guardians now, not mysteries to solve. The monastery does not demand answers, it offers rest. Each broken arch, each ivy strand is a lullaby. Breathe slowly, in through the nose, calm and steady, out through the mouth, lighter each time. Feel yourself drift as the waves rock gently in your imagination. The ghosts here are not fearful, they are kind. They keep watch not with iron or fire, but with silence. And as the last image settles, a lantern's glow fading on a ruined wall, know that you are safe, calm and ready for sleep. The monastery keeps its vigil. You keep your rest.